So welcome everybody. I'm going to introduce our speakers and we'll get right at it. We're very fortunate tonight to have Dr. Marc Pugliese and Dr. Steve Okey. Marc is the Associate Dean of our college, and Steve is a faculty member, both theology faculty member and director of our doctoral program. So I'm going to be quiet, get out of the way, and gentlemen, thank you again so much for sharing these ideas with us tonight. And then one more quick reminder, if people are interested, we have an additional roundtable coming up in 2 weeks on Eastern Catholicism. So if you're interested and have not heard about it or want more information, just shoot me an email. I'll put that in the chat, and then I'll be quiet and step out of the way for you guys. Thanks again, Steve and Marc.
Thanks, Woody. And good evening, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. And I'm going to start us off tonight with a number of general considerations when we're talking about theological research. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the why, the purpose or the telos of engaging in theological research in the first place. And oftentimes it could be for our own personal edification, but usually we're engaging in theological research for a specific audience. And there's a diversity of audiences and purposes for which we are doing theological research. It could be something like a popular audience, could be church, it could be adult religious education, RCIA, high school age students, you know, what age and what demographic are we targeting? It could be the public. There are a number of increasing number of content creators who are becoming specialists in the public eye, you know, publishing on YouTube, TikTok, other platforms. But when we talk about theological research, we often mean research done for an academic audience. And that's what I'm going to focus on here, although a lot of what I can say will be relevant for these other audiences. And the truth is, the audience for academic theological research is relatively small. It's comprised of experts, mostly, you know, obviously students, but also people who've been studying whatever you're talking about, sometimes for their whole lives. But as I think we all know, within theology, as a general discipline, there's a great diversity of subdisciplines. And you may or may not be familiar with Bernard. I'm just going to use this as an example of one taxonomy. Bernard Lonergan's, what he calls functional specialties. And he'll talk about, you know, biblical studies, church history, which is distinct from historical theology, philosophical or fundamental theology, different areas or loci of systematic or dogmatic theology. And of course, there's moral theology and social ethics and social teaching. And each of these theological subdisciplines have their own, although there's commonalities, have their own canons, methods, and expectations. And it's important, I'll say a little bit more about learning those. And as we get into theology and become experts, oftentimes we specialize in one of these subdisciplines, although oftentimes we're called upon to do research and teach in multiple areas. We tend to focus in one area. One thing I'd like to talk about, and this is, it can be relevant for the other types of audience that I mentioned, but specifically an academic audience. We are typically doing research in order to answer a specific question. And we have what is called a thesis statement. And a thesis statement should be specific, debatable, and interesting. And it should add to the common body of knowledge in that area. So it's a couple examples. An unspecific or one that lacks specificity would be something like, the Catholic intellectual tradition is a significant part of Western intellectual history. That's very broad sweeping and very general. So, and just one of many potential examples of one that is not debatable would be that the Second Vatican Council was the Catholic Church's response to developments during the modern period of Western history. Not really debatable. Something that I couldn't think of an uninteresting one, but the example I'm going to use is a leaf for history. A leaf falling off an oak tree in your backyard is in fact a fact of history, but it's trivial and uninteresting. So that would, there's a number of trivial facts that people wouldn't be interested in. What would be some examples of specific and debatable and interesting theses? Well, in biblical studies, one example would be the chronicler, if you're familiar with, Old Testament biblical scholarship, was harmonizing disparate ideas and claims in the existing texts like the Torah and the Deuteronomistic history. Another one for the New Testament would be the word pleroma, or fullness, in Colossians was used specifically with reference to proto-Gnosticism. And that's an actual debated question in the scholarship about Colossians. If you're doing an exegetical paper, your exegetical conclusions would be specific and debatable, and biblical scholars would dialogue and engage you with that. In historical theology, an example of a specific debatable thesis would be Gottschalk of Orbe faithfully followed Augustine's predestinarianism, although his theology was ultimately condemned. Another one would be that St. Thomas Aquinas's Christology is compositionalist. An example of a specific debatable thesis in church history, which again is distinct from historical theology, would be seizing church property in order to grow his assets was a prime motivation for Henry VIII's secession of the Church of England during the Protestant Reformation. And I'll give one more. In systematic theology, the concept of anonymous Christianity in Karl Rahner's Theology of Religions is too triumphalistic compared to the inclusivism expressed in official church documents like the documents of the Second Vatican Council. So these are just a couple different examples of specific debatable theses that we would see in some of these theological subdisciplines. Now, I'm going to move into some other aspects of theological research, which will include some tips. First, it's important getting back to our telos, our purpose for why we're doing theological research. The amount of research you do and the specific questions you're asking in your research will be based on the deliverable. Are you doing this for a term paper? Are you doing this for a journal article? Are you writing a dissertation or a book? And that will dictate, of course, the amount of time, the types and numbers of questions you'll be asking. Now, getting back to the specific subdisciplines in theology, and also the different audiences, whether it's a content creator like a podcaster, or you're doing it for adult religious ed, or you're writing an academic article, one good way to learn how to do theology, just like one, in a sense, learns how to write better by reading, one good way to learn how to do theological research for your specific subdiscipline and audience is to actually read the deliverables or listen to or watch the deliverables of others who are doing this and doing it well. And that's one good way to get better at this. Now, what about the actual act of doing the research? And one thing, of course, we're all interested in when our busy lives, many of us, we have families, we have work, we have ministry, we have our education and scholarship, is saving time. And there's going to pass on a couple tips here that I myself use and that I find valuable to save time in doing theological research. Number one is that, we often hear like, oh, you're using the internet, you got to be careful what sources you're looking at, don't read Wikipedia and things like that. There are a number of overviews that are kind of non-standard sources in academia that can be a helpful introduction to a general topic area, websites, content providers, etc. If you need help with something specific, it can be helpful to ask others who are knowledgeable in that discipline, and I've done that a number of times myself. I use sources to find other sources. What are the footnotes in your articles and your books that you're reading? And these can direct you to other valuable sources. Something that's very valuable, especially for students, is using book reviews. You're writing a paper on a topic, and there's like 10 or 15 really important books, and you don't have time to read them all. Well, go to your university or your institutional library and look up book reviews on those books. And oftentimes in 2 or 3 pages, you'll find usually 2 or 3 book reviews is fine. You'll get a general idea of what the book is about. And oftentimes they're very helpful for summaries and specific points, even references to page numbers. When you're looking at journal articles, you don't have time to read every single journal article you find. If one seems relevant, take a look at the abstract. And that can often give you, and if there is no abstract, just read the first couple paragraphs and the last couple paragraphs, and that will let you know, in most cases, whether or not the journal article is going to be beneficial for your project. Something that I've used, and I'll talk a little bit at the end here when I'm done speaking about interdisciplinarity and how that's becoming more and more important, is if you want to get an overview of a field, maybe that's not specifically theological, you can do this. These subdisciplines I'm talking about. If you don't know too much about New Testament scholarship, what I'm going to recommend here is using introductory level, college level textbooks on particular subjects to gain an overview of that particular field. So say you're a historical theologian or a church historian and you don't know too much about New Testament scholarship, get some good college level New Testament 101 course textbooks to learn about New Testament scholarship. But this can apply to other fields as well. If you're doing sacramental theology and you want to know a little bit about what about ritual studies and anthropology and sociology and psychology, you can get college level textbooks in those disciplines. If you're doing Catholic social teaching and you need to talk about economics, it might be helpful to revisit or to get one of those introductory level, college level textbooks on macro or microeconomics. Of course, it's imperative to get to know your theological library. And if you're a student, then you have access to an institutional library. But often you can, and I've done this, become a member of theological libraries at seminaries or universities. Oftentimes there's memberships for students, independent scholars, or professors. Something, and I'm not ashamed of doing this, obviously we can't obviously get access to every single source, but if you want to look something up, there's ways on the internet to access sources without actually having to get the physical copy or the whole ebook or something like that. You can use Amazon, Amazon previews, Google Books to look through, to search textbooks that or books you don't have. Internet Archive has a number of the full text electronically of a number of publications, Project Gutenberg, Scribd, other places like that, instead of actually having to obtain a copy through a library or actually have a physical copy. And of course, you can get books on Kindle and ebooks as well. And of course, if you are at a theological institution, especially if you're a student or employed there, you can ask the library to get sources for you, electronic sources, and they will. Something that's becoming very popular, I'll just say a few words about it, and to be frank, I think Steve himself probably knows more about it than I do, is artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence now in research. And artificial intelligence is really revolutionizing a number of things in academia, including theological research. And we can use tools to help us with our research. A common one that researchers are using is a tool called Elicit. It's elicit.org. It mainly gets journal articles, but you can type in a very specific debatable question, and it will give you a number of sources. It'll and it'll give you the abstracts, and you can add columns to say, give me a summary of what the article says, or give me its main conclusions, and it will do that. And artificial intelligence is rapidly evolving, and it's getting much better. But I'll just give you one example. I typed in Elicit the question of the date of the Gospel of Thomas. and many articles came up on the Gospel of Thomas. And, we'd have to narrow that down, and there's ways of doing that through elicit. But it did pull up one article that had nothing to do with the Gospel of Thomas. It was on St. Thomas Aquinas's commentary on the sentences. And so you do need to wait. You do need to use your own intelligence as you wade through how artificial intelligence is helping you. One final point, I'm going to wrap it up here and hand it over to Steve. But one final point that I referenced before is that within theology, and this is becoming important in all the liberal arts, but in theology as well, is the increasing importance of interdisciplinarity. And something that I myself have noticed is, we do have these subdisciplines in theology. So we have church historians who are, or even biblical scholars who are making historical claims, but there's kind of a silo or isolation of this scholarship from what people who are in the actual discipline of history are doing. What are the up-to-date methods and canons in the academic discipline of history per se? The same could be said for philosophy. Theologians are often interacting with philosophy and have studied philosophy, but how would a contemporary analytic philosopher address your question, and how are they dealing things? And one example that I've already referenced would be, if you're dealing with social ethics and Catholic social teaching, it might be helpful to learn a little bit about economics from the discipline of economics per se. So though I know that's a number of different things, and I'm happy during the Q&A we can discuss any of those points further, but at this point I'm going to wrap it up and hand it over to Steve.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for being here. It's nice to see especially several of my current students from, I think, all three of my different classes that I'm teaching this semester. So good job. This will surely help you when the end of semester comes. I thought what I might talk about would be a bit of my own process and my own understanding of the relationship between research and writing as a theologian. And so I'm going to echo and build on some of the things that Mark said, but also expand on a few points and add. So for myself, maybe 2 points that I would start with. Number one is that I think of participating in theology and participating in the process of research and writing fundamentally as a conversation into which I am entering. And I am listening to what is already out there. I am offering my own insights. I am, in a sense, being open to learning, open to having my mind change, open to making strong cases, and sort of adaptable and flexible depending on where the conversation goes. The second point that I would start with is I tend to think of the relationship of research and writing as very closely intertwined. And what I mean by that, and my doctoral students will hear this from me in a couple of weeks, but I tend to say that there's often a sort of a pivot point in any given project where you're shifting from more of a focus on research and accumulating sources and data and information towards the writing, where you're really doing your own analysis and synthesis and putting together and completing the paper, completing the podcast, completing the presentation, whatever it is. But in reality, that pivot is not like a black and white moment. And so I always encourage people to be writing already while you are doing the research. So write brief summaries of texts that you read, make outlines, make notes, keep track as you're going. And even, and on the other end of it, when you've done a lot of writing, when you've written, 5, 10, 15, 20, however many pages, you might still find sources or arguments that are really helpful and that fill in parts of what you're doing. And even more so, and I'll talk a bit more about revision in a little bit, even in the process of revising, where you've got like a thing and it's basically done and you're just fixing stuff, even then sometimes it's like, oh, I need to shore up this part of this argument. I need to, look for things that are going to help me think through this piece, that sort of thing. So the process of research and writing are always going to go together. There's always an intermix between them. Okay. So with those 2 points, with research and writing is conversation, and research and writing as deeply intermingled with one another. My overall process is more or less, and it follows some of the points that Marc was making. Number one, I have some kind of question. And so I have something I want to know, and presumably it's something that I don't already know. And so when Marc was talking about like uninteresting thesis statements, some of you who have had to write papers before maybe know the most uninteresting thesis statements are the papers that you don't actually have any interest in writing. Like you just don't care. And so you should be writing about and pursuing questions that are interesting to you. Now, obviously, as students, you are sometimes constrained by an assignment that puts limitations on what you can do. It's frustrating. My suggestion in that case is work within the boundaries that you are given and talk with your professor about the ways that you might press on those boundaries to make it more worthwhile for you. I will say for everybody in this call who is a faculty member, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, but every one of us genuinely enjoys talking with a student about a paper they are interested in vastly more than talking with a student about a paper the student has little to no interest in, okay? And so we can always try to make accommodations and adjustments to make a project more worthwhile for you, really. With that question, because it's a question, I don't know the answer yet. So working on a thesis, I will eventually have a final thesis. When I'm done, I will have a completed thesis. At the very beginning, I usually have a provisional guess. I think the answer to my question is going to be something like this. It's in this ballpark. I don't know the details. I don't know the specifics. My mind might change, but my hunch is this is where I'm going to go. I also, at the beginning, and this goes to Marc's point about deliverables. So one is, I definitely think about who I'm doing this for. Fundamentally, for students, you're writing for teachers. And so it's good to have a sense for who you're writing for as a teacher, their expectations, that sort of thing. That is not to say, write the paper you think your teacher wants to hear, okay? It's great and engaging when students say thoughtful things that push back on arguments I've made. But what we do want to hear is, or what we do want to read is something that is interesting, well-structured, well-argued, and well thought through. So if you're writing for a teacher, that's part of your audience. If you're writing to give a presentation, think about where you're going to be giving that presentation. If it's at an academic conference, if it's like you were saying at RCIA, at a Bible study. For those of you who have ministerial responsibilities and maybe you're going to be preaching, think about who you're preaching to, right? So you want to think about audience. Something else I think is incredibly important is scope. And this is one of the things, and my doctoral students have heard me harp about this several times already. You have to think about the scope of your project. And that cuts in a lot of different ways. So one of them is length. It makes a big difference if you're writing a 2-page paper versus a 20-page paper versus like a 200-page dissertation. It makes a huge difference in terms of the level of detail and the breadth of what you can do and what you have to do at that length. Many of you who have had me in class before know writing shorter is actually often much harder than writing longer pieces because you have to make cuts, you have to make adjustments, you have to define yourself really quickly and fairly narrowly. You also need to think about scope in terms of time. And so if you're turning something around, in a day, a week, that's different from a couple of months, that's different from a couple of years. And so very often, the length of the deliverable and the amount of time you have will more or less coincide, but frankly, not always. So think about that part of it. And then also in terms of scope, just think about what do I need to succeed at this? What do I need in terms of resources, in terms of books, texts, videos? If I'm doing interviews, people I need to have access to interview. And if you have significant resource limitations that you simply can't get through, that's going to affect the type of argument you're gonna make. So just as an example, if you wanted to do a really good, theological analysis of, like current in 19th century French Catholic thought, right? Great topic, personal interest to me. You can do that without knowing any French. Like most things are in translation, you can get them, but a lot of things aren't. And if you can't read French, then you're not going to use French sources, right? That's a limitation that you're going to have. That will sometimes adjust the kind of things you're going to look at. If you want to do a really creative project on, the development of Catholicism in China, similarly, language and cultural issues can sometimes be an obstacle in terms of scope. It's not an absolute thing, but there are cases where you want to know the language, you might want to be able to travel, you might want access to things you don't have access to. So that's a factor. Question, thesis, audience scope. The next thing I push people on, and my doctoral students know this one is coming soon, is structure. I typically, when I start working on a project and I've kind of got my idea worked out and I more or less know what I'm doing, I start figuring out what do I think the structure of this is going to be. And so I usually start with what is literally like a 5 or 6 sentence outline or a short paragraph. And then I start breaking it into pieces and figuring out roughly what I need to accomplish in each part of my overall argument. Okay. And so if the overall argument I'm going to make has, say, like 4 major steps, well, I figure out what those are. I figure out what are the pieces that are going to go in there, kind of what do I think I need, and I tackle them as I can. And sometimes I tackle later sections earlier because I have access to those resources now, or it's material I'm more familiar with, whatever. I never write in order for my own self. There are a lot of different ways to outline and organize a project. The 2 most obvious ones, and these work in a lot of cases, so I don't mean obvious in a bad way, but one is chronological, which is to look at, a sequence of events, to look at how, the Christology of the church develops over several 100-year period, to look at, the development of Catholic social teaching in the 19th and 20th centuries, like those kinds of things. Chronological makes a lot of sense. Especially anything with a strong historical bent, chronology makes a lot of sense. The other one is some kind of thematic structure. And so if you're going through the key central themes of something, so it might be, the sacraments of initiation, or it might be Catholic thought in North America, Europe, and Africa, right? Like you can have these sort of thematic structures that organize things. I would also advocate for thinking about other possible styles of organization depending on the kind of argument you're making. So for example, people will sometimes move from material that they expect to be more familiar to their audience, things that the audience is going to be comfortable with and know something about, and then progressively move to what is unfamiliar, what is new, what is creative. Okay, so that's an alternate sort of trajectory you can go. Another one, and this speaks to Marc's point about having, debatable, interesting, theses. You might move from something that is fairly obvious or widely accepted, and then move step by step by step into something that is more debated, more controversial. Okay, and additionally, all these forms of organization can be sort of adapted to each other. You can do more than one. But you want to think about how you actually organize a paper in such a way that you get your audience from your question and thesis to believing your conclusion, okay? And the more organized and structured and clear that is, the easier the experience is for the reader, okay? So if you've ever gotten feedback from a professor that is sort of like, I don't understand where you're going with this, it's often a reflection of an organizational problem more than anything else, because we can't see the steps of where you're going, okay, in my experience. All right. Then I guess sort of like the third or last major thing I would highlight is in this process, you're going to revise, okay? And one thing that many people struggle with is cutting material that they've already written. And there's this famous phrase, especially using creative writing, but in writing of all kinds, and it's murder your darlings. And the idea of murder your darlings is sometimes you have written a sentence or a paragraph or a page or a footnote, and it's beautiful and it's intelligent and it really makes a phenomenal point, and that point does not have anything to do with your paper anymore. And it's not going to help your argument, and it doesn't fit. You need to learn to let it go. Now, if you have trouble letting go, because people do have that problem sometimes, cut it, put another document, name the document, like my cuts file, that's what I call it. My special file, my emotional support file, whatever, but like move it over, let it go. It might be useful later. It might be useful for something else. You might never see it again. But you have to be willing to cut things. You have to be willing to make adjustments. You also, and this is one of the especially challenging things that I deal with in writing, is you sometimes need to reorganize. And so you go back to this outline you came up with, and the substance is all there, but the order actually doesn't make sense. And you realize there's a point you were assuming, you need to make it earlier, things like that. It's annoying. But revising is, I think, one of the most overlooked and most essential parts of being an effective theological researcher and writer. So you want to be able to work on revision. And so, yeah, so I guess to conclude on my end, then we can go to Q&A. Part of the process of research and writing, part of why I think about it as conversation, part of why for instance, I never have a final thesis statement at the beginning of the project, is because I don't know the answer. Part of what makes the process interesting for me is I'm not sure. And so I always encourage people to be adaptable, to be flexible, to be open to the way that the work carries you, the way that a really good conversation carries you, right? Like you get in the zone and you just kind of go with it, and it's wonderful and exciting. And you get past that point where you're thinking about the next thing you're going to say, and like there's that wonderful sort of moment in research and in writing where it just kind of, I don't know, you hit like a flow state, right? That's what we'll call it. And sometimes that takes you places you just aren't expecting to go, and I think you really have to be open to that. I think it's especially true when you're working on a longer term project, things like that. And so just as an example, I have a journal article that's coming out, I think this month or next month. And it came out of a conference paper I gave maybe 4 years ago now. And when I wrote the proposal for the paper, I had in the conclusion, I had these like three sort of theses, these three ideas, right? Like these are three possible interpretations of a question. And in the process, and so that was the proposal, that goes like into the conference book, like that was what everyone thought I was gonna be doing. And by the time I got there, I realized like none of those three were actually correct. And so I talked about them because I was saying these were all possible interpretations, but I had realized the fourth one in the process very, very late. And I say this somewhat shamefacedly, like writing in the hotel room at the conference, like finishing up the paper. I had figured out like what the actual argument was, like what the best interpretation was. And it reshaped my thesis and it reshaped my argument, and for the better, like absolutely for the better. But if I had remained sort of rigidly committed to my earlier versions of what the paper was going to be, I would have missed an insight. So be flexible. And with that, I will turn it back over to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Woodard.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. Now we just have time for questions and answers, so we can open it up and people can feel free to use either the chat box or just unmute and jump in. We've got a small enough group where most people besides Mike won't get out of hand. So whatever works best for people.
I have a question. Hi, Steve. How are you? Good to see you again. We were in classic.
Yeah, good to see you.
It was interesting that you brought up just at the end, you talked about that insight at the end, because it's always interesting to think about when you start to write a paper. Do you start with your conclusion and build on that, or do you let it flow to get to that conclusion? What do you think is the better approach?
So my advice generally, and this is from what I do, is my process. So like I have my question, I try to sort of work out an outline, figure out the things I need to do. I then write what I will essentially say is like a crappy introduction. And I say that because I know that introduction will change dramatically. Like it will be completely rewritten by the end, but I need like that little like runner to get me going. And then I work out the body of the paper almost entirely before I even start a conclusion. And And then after I have that more or less worked out, I draft a conclusion, I go back, I fix the introduction, I read through the whole thing a couple of times. But yeah, I tell people, like, the introduction and the conclusion, it's kind of a funny thing, because like Marc made a very good point. When you're looking at articles or you're looking at books, look at the introduction, look at the conclusion. It will basically tell you the substance of the thing. Those are also often, for me, and I think for a lot of people, the last things you actually write. And so, because it's only after you've done all the grunt work in the middle that you can really understand what those are going to be, in my experience.
Right.
Yeah, Alex.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much. I have two questions. I want to start with one that anyone is kind of free to jump in on, but do you all have any tips for, especially for longer works, but really for any research writing, tips for effective note taking? Like, do you do anything different when you're taking notes for a big paper or a book or dissertation or something, as opposed to just taking notes in a normal class for like an exam or something like that?
I can briefly comment on that. I'd say when I was in graduate school, like when I was back in the day in high school, you're taught, this is way back in the day, you used to take, when you're writing a research paper, to write on note cards, your points. I don't know if anyone remembers that, too old to remember that, but that's how I was taught, like in grammar school and high school. But I think it was maybe college, probably graduate school, I started taking notes for big projects, like especially with my dissertation, on a computer. So as like, if I was, as I was reading my sources, and now there's like, you can use any number of devices now, but at the time it was like a big, laptop computer, and I'd be reading my sources. And then other times when I didn't have an electronic source, if I had a paper copy that I could keep notes on, I would make notes in the margins, and like at the front of the page, I'd flip to the front and say, the page, see these pages, page 12, page 51 for specific points. So I've done that as well.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think people always end up with kind of their own styles. I do some of what Marc does. So when especially with books, I tend to prefer books to ebooks, and I have my sort of own system of marginal notation. I have very bad handwriting, and so I do marks and stuff, and I write very few words because even I can't read them often in the margins afterwards. But then once I have those, I will read through a book doing that, but I will sometimes every chapter, sometimes when I'm done with a book, I will go back through and type notes. And sometimes that's quotations if I think they're really important, but mostly it's trying to paraphrase and sort of summarize key things. When I work with journal articles, I actually most prefer using PDFs at this point. And what's great about PDFs is you can highlight and comment and all of that. And what I was really excited to learn like 8 months ago, and it revolutionized it for me, is you can highlight something and then attach the note to that highlight. Like, it saved me so much time doing it this way. And so I use that when I have any kind of PDF or electronic source. So those are those two pieces. The other part of the challenge, Alex, that you're really identifying is also how to keep track of all of this. And so it's really easy to just have like a proliferation of files or things like that. It's easy to get lost. And so one thing I say is like, have a place to keep things. So I use, I don't recommend it for everybody because it has a kind of steep learning curve, but I use a word processor called Scrivener. And what Scrivener is really great for is you have like a file for a project, and you can have sort of an unlimited number of sections in it. And so I have some that are drafts, and I have some that are notes, and I'll keep notes on text and things like that in there. The other thing I like about Scrivener is it will let you do a sort of a split screen thing where you can have two texts next to each other. And it can be the same file in different spots, which is really helpful when I'm editing. So I like that part a lot. But Scrivener, it takes a little getting used to. And so if you like that challenge, it's great. If you are comfortable with Word or Google Docs, whatever else you're using. Those are great too. The other thing I really strongly recommend is have some kind of reference management program. And so I use Zotero. There's a ton. There's RefWorks and EndNote, and there's one that starts with an M that I can never remember. But those are great for keeping track of all of the sources you've actually read, looked at, used, considered, things like that. And they all have some way to keep notes that are attached to sources. So you can put in like tags, notes, things like that. Really useful, terrible article, whatever, right? Those pieces. You can often organize them by like create libraries. So I have for each product, I have a library that will have, you know, whatever sources I've been using for it. I have the same thing for classes actually. And it will, at least Zotero, which is the one that I use and I recommend because it's free and has a cloud storage and all that. It will extract notes that I have in PDFs into a separate file for me. So it saves a step in that regard. So I don't know if that answers your question, Alex, but those are the things I do.
That's all super helpful. Thank you all.
So I wanted to just comment quickly on Ullman on your question about, you know, original sources, commentaries, things like that. It depends a little bit. If the assignment has a specific limitation or restriction on it, then you have to work with that and talk with the professor if you want to make adjustments. But in general, I think most research is usually involves some combination of what we think of as primary and secondary sources. And the balance between those depends on the project, and it depends on the sources, and depends on the argument. But there's always some amount of both. And so it really depends a little bit on, what as a student, what the assignment is asking you to do. So.
Great, thank you.
So.
And we have a little bit of time if people have other questions.
Hi, this is Alex again. Don't want to dominate the conversation, but one other question I had, and this kind of goes back to a little more of what Dr. Marc was saying in his, I think, introduction, but anyone feel free to comment, especially when we're talking about I think the three terms were specific, debatable, and interesting as far as like a thesis or just an argument. I remember in undergrad, I was in a history class and the professor talked about encouraged us to make like weaker, more broad claims because those made for stronger arguments. They were harder to beat because it was a weaker claim. So how would you recommend balancing like that idea against the importance of specificity and debatability?
Wow, what a strategy. I've never heard, I don't know if I've heard that one, but harder to beat.
I
The
might be
problem is-
misrepresenting him.
Sure, no, but I think the converse flip side to that is that within an academic community of scholars who are like familiar with the subject matter, I think that many would say that, you know, if it's very general or broad, it is harder to prove. Like, I think the onus would be put back on you saying, yeah, it might be hard to disprove, but it's hard to prove. And as you're entering the fray of a theological debate about a specific topic, you're basically saying that, oh, I can make this claim and I can back it up. So I think it's the question of where the onus of responsibility is shifted. Yeah, it would be hard to disprove certain types of claims, but since you're jumping into the discussion, the onus is on you to prove it. So you have a responsibility to make a claim that can be proven instead of being too general and difficult to prove. I don't know. Steve might have more to add.
Yeah, my first reaction is that just sounds like terrible advice. And I'm thinking about it a little bit more. I think that there are places where having a very general claim fits, depending on the audience and the deliverable and all sorts of things. Like, I don't think universally it's the case. But I think in most academic writing, at least that in most cases, I think you do want to be specific and debatable and interesting. They don't all have to be sort of barn burner provocative arguments. And a lot of times when you're making the argument, you know, like by the end, you think like, this is pretty convincing. And so even though it's debatable, like you think many people reading it will be persuaded, right? Like, I think that that's part of it. The other, I guess, point I would add is, and this goes back to why I think of all of this process as conversational, is like, think about the interesting conversations you have in your life. Like, I mean, sometimes they're kind of general and vague, but they're often much more rewarding and satisfying and engaging the more that they actually delve into like specific, interesting aspects of life, you know, and not just sort of floating on the surface of generalities. And the other piece of it is, and I don't think this is what your professor meant, but I think it's a reasonable reading of what your professor said, as quoted by you. I don't think of research and writing as being ultimately about winning. And the phrasing of like, it's harder to beat my argument just sounds to me like, oh, we've turned this into a like win-lose competition. And there are plenty of academics who approach academia this way, don't get me wrong. I just think it's an unhealthy way to approach academia in the end, right? Like, you want to be like, you have a question you're trying to answer because you find it interesting and you think other people find it interesting. It's not about, you know, like trying to beat your opponent into submission, because that makes the telos different from what it actually should be. So
I have something. Yeah, Alex, how are you? Good to see you again. We're in Mariology together.
Yeah, great to see you, Michael.
Yep. You know, it's funny because I've actually heard it differently. What I got as a cautionary tale is that don't try to create a straw man argument so it looks like you could easily defeat it when you're engaging in the debate process of a paper. So maybe that's what he was getting at. I don't know, but it almost sounds like a reverse type of straw man situation where it's like you got to be the straw man in an argument that really can't be beat, and you want to try to beat it. So I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but I mean, I did know in my prior classes they were very specific about saying be careful with what's called the straw man argument, where you present the debate, but it's really not a debate. It's easy to, you're not taking the best arguments in opposition and countering them. You're creating an argument that can be easily taken over, and it's not the best way to approach it. Or at least that's what I've been told.
Thank you for the input and advice, everybody. I am hopeful that I'm misinterpreting or misremembering my professor, but this is all really helpful, especially the unfalsifiable and like burden of proof piece, and in conjunction with that, yeah, perhaps trying to win the paper is not the best approach.
I do want to just quickly piggyback on something Michael just said, and maybe, I don't know, maybe because of my last name, I'm pugilistic and I want to win. You know, I want to fight these arguments and beat down my opponents. No, but I still think it's important that you do, you know, put your best foot forward. And even if you are looking at this as a conversation and not a competition, you still want to be compelling. And Michael made the good point here, you know, obviously, whatever point you're arguing against, you know, obviously you're making a claim which excludes other ones. Oftentimes there's an antithesis or a counter thesis that you're directly arguing against. It's very important. Your argument will be stronger the more you can anticipate. Maybe you'll read them, maybe you can anticipate them yourself, you'll see it in the literature. The best possible arguments for the other side that you don't agree with, and addressing them. If you preempt them, that will make your argument that much stronger, and that's important to do specifically in academic writing. But it can help in popular audiences too. If you know that, you know, people in church might have a kind of a gut reaction to something that you're going to say, it's good to know that and try to anticipate that. That'll just help the whole thing go much better.
Yeah, I was writing about this in one of my classes recently. There's this sort of newer term people will use of the Steelman argument, which is where like you take someone's claim and you actually make it better. Like you strengthen it. You make it like a really good, strong, compelling, like anyone would consider this kind of claim. And then that's the one that you really try to respond to, because that is much more impressive. And I used last year, I was teaching an honors course, and we had a bunch of women from the lacrosse team in class. We were talking about how to make arguments, things like that. And so the example I used with the students was like, so like you, like ladies of the lacrosse team, you're a Division II college lacrosse team. Do you think you could beat an 8th grade lacrosse team in a match? And obviously, yes. Like, they're like, clearly we could do that. And I was like, could you beat your like crosstown Division II rival in lacrosse? And they're like, we think so. We have beaten them before, right? And I asked, like, which of these wins is more impressive? Is it beating the 8th graders, or is it beating your crosstown rivals? And it's obviously the crosstown rivals. If you pick on and beat up crappy, weak strawman counter arguments, like, it might feel good, maybe, I don't know, but it's just not as compelling, it's not as impressive. And I encourage students, like, whenever I teach, the Summa by Thomas Aquinas, right? Like, the question, like, the article's open with objections, and these are not stupid objections. Like, in his time, these are interesting, compelling, thoughtful objections that he takes very seriously, and it helps set up his argument. You don't have to follow his organizational structure to get the same kind of like idea out of it. So others?
No stress. I think we I got a visitor here. This was a wonderful presentation. So let's make sure that we thank Steve and Mark. And also, one thing that you've demonstrated to us also is the importance of community in this work too. A great community of students, faculty, who really work through all of these things together, share ideas, and we build each other up, and build the kingdom of God through this work. So thank you for demonstrating how we do that together. And Mark and Steve, thanks so much for your time. And thanks also for everybody joining us this evening. There's all sorts of things you could be doing. So it's wonderful to have this time together to share ideas and all grow together. So thanks for being here. And someone did ask earlier about the next one. I think we're 2 weeks from tonight, so I put the flyer there, and people can always reach out to me. If you're not on the mailing list for the roundtables, I put my email address in there. And once again, thanks for being here this evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
701 students, I'll see you tomorrow.